What started as a peaceful retirement by a pristine lake turned into a legal war that would expose decades of deception, forged documents, and a conspiracy that ran deeper than anyone imagined. This is the story of how one man's fight to fish on his own property uncovered the biggest HOA fraud in county history. The morning mist still clung to Mirror Lake's surface when David Chang cast his first line of the day. At 62, the retired engineer had finally found his slice of paradise, a modest lakefront cabin he'd purchased 3 years earlier in Pine Ridge Estates. The realtor had been clear. The property came with exclusive lake access, fishing rights, and a small private dock. It was everything David had dreamed of for his golden years. But paradise, as David would soon discover, had a price he never saw coming. The trouble began on a Tuesday in late September. David was enjoying his usual dawn fishing ritual when he noticed a small motorboat approaching. Behind the wheel sat Margaret Holloway, the stern-faced president of the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association. Her perfectly coiffed silver hair caught the morning light as she cut the engine near David's dock. "Mr. Chen," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I need to speak with you immediately." David reeled in his line, sensing the tension in her tone. Margaret had always been cordial during their brief encounters at community meetings, though something in her eyes had always made him uneasy. Today, that something had crystallized into open hostility. "There's been a mistake," Margaret announced as she stepped onto his dock without invitation. "A serious mistake regarding your fishing privileges." David set down his rod, his engineering mind already calculating the implications. "What kind of mistake?" Margaret produced a manila folder from her waterproof bag, her movements deliberate and practiced, according to our association's founding documents. Exclusive fishing rights to Mirror Lake belong solely to the HOA. Individual property owners are granted limited access, but only with proper permits and seasonal restrictions. The blood drained from David's face as he scanned the documents. The papers appeared official, complete with county seals and legal terminology that made his head spin. But something felt wrong. These weren't the same documents he'd reviewed during his property purchase. "This can't be right," David protested, his voice trembling with the first hints of anger. "My deed clearly states." "Your deed is irrelevant," Margaret interrupted, snatching the papers back. "These association bylaws supersede individual property rights, effective immediately. You're in violation of association rules. Fishing is prohibited until you obtain proper permits and pay the required fees." David's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "And what exactly are these fees?" Margaret's smile was as cold as the lake water. $5,000 annually, plus a one-time assessment fee of $15,000 to join the fishing club. All current members were grandfathered in. Of course, $20,000. The number hit David like a physical blow. He'd stretched his retirement savings to buy this property specifically for the fishing rights that were supposedly already his. There was no way he could afford such an astronomical fee. "I'll need to review this with my attorney," David said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Of course," Margaret replied, her tone suggesting she'd expected this response. "But until this matter is resolved, Any fishing activities will result in immediate fines of $1,000 per incident. We have security cameras now, Mr. Chen. We'll be watching. As Margaret's boat disappeared around the bend, David stood alone on his dock, staring at the fishing rod that suddenly felt foreign in his hands. 3 years of peaceful mornings, 3 years of believing he'd finally found his retirement sanctuary, had just evaporated in a single conversation. That evening, David spread his property documents across his kitchen table. The deed was clear, including all riparian rights, fishing privileges, and lake access appurtenant to said property. But the HOA documents Margaret had shown him told a different story entirely. The discrepancy was glaring, almost impossibly so. David reached for his phone and dialed his real estate attorney, Thomas Walsh. After explaining the situation, Walsh's response was immediate and unsettling. David, I reviewed those HOA documents during your purchase. What you're describing doesn't match anything I saw. Either someone made a significant error, or what? Or someone's playing games with forged documents. The next morning brought David's worst fears to life. A certified letter from the Pine Ridge HOA legal department arrived at his doorstep. Inside was a formal cease and desist order, threatening immediate legal action if David continued fishing on association property. The letter was signed by Margaret Holloway and notarized by the county clerk. But it was the final paragraph that made David's blood run cold. Continued violations may result in forced sale of property to satisfy association debts and fines. They weren't just trying to stop him from fishing. They were threatening to take his home. David's hands shook as he dialed Thomas Walsh again. This wasn't just about fishing anymore. This was about everything he'd worked his entire life to achieve. His retirement, his peace, his future. Tom, David said when the attorney answered, I think we're going to war. The sleepless nights began immediately. David found himself pacing his cabin at 3 a.m., staring out at the moonlit lake that had once brought him such peace. Now it mocked him, its serene surface hiding the legal quicksand that threatened to swallow everything he'd built. Thomas Walsh arrived at David's cabin on a gray Thursday morning, armed with legal pads and a grim expression. The attorney's usual confident demeanor had been replaced by something David had never seen before: uncertainty. I've been practicing property law for 23 years, Walsh said, spreading documents across David's dining table, and I've never seen anything quite like this. David poured coffee with trembling hands, the ceramic mug rattling against the pot. 3 days without proper sleep had left him feeling like a ghost of himself. What did you find? Walsh held up 2 sets of documents side by side. These are the HOA bylaws from your original property purchase in 2021. And these are the documents Margaret Holloway presented to you last week. They're completely different. The differences were stark. Even to David's untrained eye, the original bylaws clearly stated that lakefront property owners retained all riparian rights. The new version granted exclusive lake control to the HOA board. Someone has been very busy, Walsh continued, his voice darkening. I pulled the filing records from the county clerk's office. According to their system, these new bylaws were officially recorded last month. But here's the problem, I spoke With 3 other homeowners who attended the association meeting where these changes were supposedly voted on. David leaned forward, hope flickering in his chest, and there was no such meeting. No vote, no notice to homeowners. These bylaws were filed without proper procedure. Walsh's eyes gleamed with the first hint of his old confidence. David, I think someone just handed us a smoking gun. But Walsh's optimism was short-lived. That afternoon brought a devastating blow that would shake David's faith in the justice system itself. A process server appeared at his door with a lawsuit filed by the Pine Ridge HOA, claiming David owed over $50,000 in back fees, fines, and assessments stretching back to his property purchase. They're claiming you've been fishing illegally for 3 years, Walsh explained over the phone, his voice tight with controlled anger. They want the money, plus interest, plus their attorney fees. David, they're asking for your house as collateral. The emotional toll was crushing. David found himself unable to eat, unable to focus on anything beyond the legal documents that seemed to multiply on his table like a paper virus. His retirement savings, carefully accumulated over decades of engineering work, were being depleted by attorney fees. The fishing rod that had once brought him such joy now sat in the corner, gathering dust like an artifact from a happier life. But it was during his darkest moment that David discovered he wasn't alone in this fight. A knock at his door revealed Jonna Morrison, a neighbor from 3 houses down, holding a casserole dish and wearing an expression of barely contained fury. I heard what Margaret's doing to you, Jonna said, pushing past David into his kitchen. And I want you to know she tried the same thing with my husband 2 years ago. David's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Jonna set down the casserole and pulled out her phone. Roger used to kayak on the lake every morning. Then Margaret showed up with some new rule about watercraft permits. She demanded $3,000. When Roger refused, they started fining him daily. What happened? We paid, Jonna admitted, her voice heavy with regret. We couldn't afford to fight it. But Roger recorded their conversation. She held up her phone. He recorded everything. The audio was devastating. Margaret's voice was crystal clear, discussing with another HOA board member how they planned to squeeze out the troublemakers and maximize revenue from lake access. Most damning of all was Margaret's casual mention of updating the bylaws retroactively to support their position. There are others, Jonna continued. The Hendersons were forced to sell after Margaret claimed their dock violated new association rules. The Patels stopped using their boat launch after being hit with mysterious environmental compliance fees. She's been systematically targeting anyone who won't pay her inflated fees. Walsh nearly dropped his phone when David called with the news. This isn't just fraud, the attorney said, his voice electric with excitement. This is racketeering. David, we need to contact the FBI. But Margaret Holloway was unfinished. The next morning brought a new nightmare. David woke to find his dock wrapped in yellow caution tape and posted with official-looking notices declaring it a safety hazard. Pending environmental review, security cameras had been installed overnight. Their lenses trained directly on his property. The psychological warfare was working. David felt like a prisoner in his own home. afraid to step outside for fear of triggering more fines or legal action. His hand shook as he tried to dial Walsh's number, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a physical force. "They're escalating," Walsh said after David described the latest developments. "But so are we. I've been in touch with the county prosecutor's office. They're very interested in what we've uncovered." That evening, as David sat alone in his darkened cabin, staring out at the lake that had become his battlefield, he made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to pay Margaret's extortion fees, and he certainly wasn't going to let her steal his home. David picked up his fishing rod for the first time in weeks, opened his front door, and walked deliberately toward his dock. The security cameras tracked his movement as he cast his line into the moonlit water. "Come and get me," he whispered into the night. The courthouse steps felt like a mountain as David climbed them on that cold Monday morning in November. His hand gripped Thomas Walsh's arm for support, not from physical weakness, but from the crushing weight of everything that had led to this moment. Behind them, a small crowd of neighbors who had suffered under Margaret Holloway's reign followed in silent solidarity. Inside courtroom for B, Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table with her attorney, Richard Blackwood, a sharp-dressed man, whose reputation for ruthless tactics preceded him. She wore a navy business suit and an expression of absolute confidence, occasionally whispering to Blackwood while casting dismissive glances toward David's side of the room. Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation to David's neighbor John, called the session to order. Her reputation for no-nonsense proceedings was legendary in the county, and both sides knew she wouldn't tolerate the tricks. "This is a civil matter regarding property rights and HOA authority," Judge Morrison announced. "Mr. Blackwood, you may present your opening statement." Blackwood rose smoothly, his practiced smile radiating false sincerity. "Your Honor, this is a simple case of a homeowner refusing to follow established community rules. Mr. Chen has been fishing illegally on association property for 3 years, racking up fines and fees that now total over $50,000. The Pine Ridge HOA has the authority to regulate lake access, and Mr. Chen's continued defiance threatens the stability of our entire community." He gestured toward a stack of documents. These association bylaws, properly filed and recorded, clearly establish the HOA's exclusive authority over Mirror Lake. Mr. Chen's fishing activities are not only unauthorized, they're destructive to the delicate ecosystem our association works hard to preserve. David watched Margaret not approvingly, her confidence seemingly unshakable. But Walsh had prepared for this moment with the precision of a surgeon. "Your Honor," Walsh began, rising slowly for maximum effect, "what we have here is a case of homeowner defiance. What we have here is the systematic fraud of a community association, orchestrated by individuals who have perverted the legal system for personal gain." The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted palpably. Margaret's confident expression flickered for just a moment before reasserting itself. Walsh continued, "Over the past 2 months, we have uncovered evidence of forged documents, illegal bylaw modifications, and what can only be described as an extortion scheme targeting vulnerable homeowners. Mrs. Holloway and her associates have weaponized the HOA structure to steal fishing rights, dock access, and ultimately entire properties from their rightful owners. Blackwood objected immediately. Your Honor, these are serious accusations without foundation. My client has followed all proper procedures. Mr. Blackwood. Judge Morrison interrupted. You'll have your chance to respond, Mr. Walsh. I assume you have evidence to support these claims. Walsh's smile was razor sharp. Indeed we do, Your Honor. I'd like to call Jonna Morrison to the stand. Jeanette's testimony was devastating. She described in detail how Margaret had targeted her husband Roger with fabricated permit requirements and escalating fines. But it was when Walsh played Roger's secret recording that the courtroom erupted. Margaret's voice filled the room, crystal clear and damning. The key is to make the fees so high they can't afford to fight. Most of them will just pay or sell. Either way, we control the lake access and pocket the money. The beauty is, by the time they figure out what's happening, we've already updated the bylaws to cover OR tracks. The color drained from Margaret's face as her own words echoed off the courtroom walls. Blackwood was frantically scribbling notes, his earlier confidence evaporating. But Walsh wasn't finished. Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibit C security footage from the county clerk's office. The video showed Margaret entering the clerk's office at 4:47 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. Just 13 minutes before closing, she carried a manila envelope and spoke briefly with the clerk before disappearing into the filing room. 13 minutes later, she emerged empty-handed. The timestamp on this footage, Walsh explained, corresponds exactly with the filing date of the fraudulent bylaws presented to my client. Mrs. Holloway filed these documents without HOA board approval, without homeowner notice, and without proper legal procedure. Margaret leaned over to whisper urgently in Blackwood's ear, but the attorney's expression suggested damage control rather than confidence. The afternoon brought David's moment to testify. His voice trembled as he described the emotional toll of Margaret's campaign, the sleepless nights, the fear of losing his home. But it was his description of the lake itself that brought unexpected emotion to the proceedings. I saved for 30 years to buy that cabin, David said, his voice breaking slightly. After my wife passed, it was the only place that brought me peace. When I cast my line into that water, I felt connected to something larger than myself. Margaret didn't just try to steal my fishing rights, she tried to steal my healing. The courtroom was silent except for the soft sounds of several spectators wiping their eyes. But the day's most explosive moment came when Walsh called an unexpected witness. Deputy County Clerk Sarah C. had no relation to David. Her testimony revealed that Margaret had been filing document modifications for the Pine Ridge HOA for over 2 years. Outside normal procedures, she always came in right before closing, Sarah testified. She'd say it was urgent HOA business, and the board had authorized emergency filings. I followed protocol and processed the documents. But in hindsight, the pattern was suspicious. Blackwood's cross-examination was desperate and brief. When he suggested that David should have simply paid the association fees to avoid conflict, Walsh's objection was sustained before the question was complete. As the day concluded, Judge Morrison's expression was unreadable. But the damage to Margaret's case was obvious. The woman who had entered the courtroom radiating confidence now sat hunched over her legal pad, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. "We'll reconvene tomorrow morning for closing arguments," Judge Morrison announced. Court is adjourned. Outside the courthouse, David allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. But he had no idea that the biggest revelation was still to come. The final day dawned gray and cold, matching the tension that filled courtroom for B. David arrived early, his hands steady for the first time in months. Walsh had worked through the night preparing his closing argument, but both men knew they had already presented their strongest evidence. Now it was time for judgment. Judge Morrison entered with the gravity of someone about to render a decision that would reshape an entire community. The gallery was packed with Pine Ridge residents, many of whom had suffered under Margaret's regime, but had been too afraid to speak out until now. "Before we proceed with closing arguments," Judge Morrison announced, "I want to address some developments that occurred overnight." David's heart skipped. Walsh shot him a questioning glance. Neither of them knew what she meant. "Mrs. Holloway," the judge continued, her voice carrying the weight of authority, "I understand you wish to address the court." Margaret rose slowly, her usual composure completely shattered. Gone was the confident woman who had threatened David on his dock just 2 months earlier. In her place stood someone who looked fragile, defeated, and oddly relieved. "Your Honor," Margaret began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell the truth." The courtroom erupted in whispers before Judge Morrison's gavel restored order. Blackwood was frantically trying to speak with his client, but Margaret waved him away. "For the past 3 years, I have been systematically defrauding homeowners in Pine Ridge estates. I forged association documents, filed illegal bylaw modifications, and collected fees that were never authorized by the HOA board." Her voice grew stronger as she continued, as if confession was lifting a tremendous burden. "Mr. Chen never owed us a single penny. His fishing rights were legitimate from the day he purchased his property." David felt the world spinning round him. After months of legal warfare, Margaret was simply admitting everything. But she wasn't finished. "Your Honor, I didn't act alone in this scheme. I was being blackmailed." The second explosion of courtroom whispers was even louder than the first. Judge Morrison's gavel cracked like thunder as she restored order. Margaret's hand shook as she pulled out a manila envelope. 3 years ago, I was approached by someone who claimed to have evidence of financial irregularities in my previous job as city treasurer. The evidence was fabricated, but it looked convincing enough to destroy my reputation and send me to prison. Walsh was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, if Mrs. Holloway is claiming duress, let her finish," Judge Morrison commanded. Margaret opened the envelope and withdrew a series of photographs and documents. "I was told that if I didn't cooperate in this scheme to extract money from Pine Ridge homeowners, these fabricated documents would be turned over to the district attorney. I was told that the money I collected would be handled by my blackmailer, and that I would be protected as long as I followed instructions." The revelation hit David like a physical blow. Margaret hadn't been the mastermind, she had been another victim. "Who was blackmailing you, Mrs. Holloway?" Judge Morrison asked. Margaret's eyes moved across the courtroom before settling on a figure in the back row. David turned to follow her gaze and felt his blood freeze. Richard Blackwood, Margaret's own attorney, was quietly gathering his papers and moving toward the exit. "Mr. Blackwood," Judge Morrison's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade, "please return to your seat." The attorney stopped mid-stride, his shoulders sagging in defeat. When he turned around, his face held the expression of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing. "Your Honor," Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength, "Richard Blackwood orchestrated this entire scheme. He created the fabricated evidence against me, drafted the forged HOA documents, and collected the majority of the money extracted from homeowners. I was allowed to keep just enough to maintain appearances, while he profited from the fear and confusion of vulnerable retirees." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Blackwood hadn't just been representing Margaret, he had been controlling her. The aggressive legal tactics, the escalating threats, the systematic targeting of elderly homeowners, it had all been designed to maximize profit while using Margaret as a shield. "Mr. Blackwood," Judge Morrison said, her voice deadly calm, "I assume you have something to say about these allegations." Blackwood's response was to bolt for the courtroom door. He made it exactly 6 steps before 2 bailiffs intercepted him. As they escorted him back to the defense table, his facade of professional competence crumbled entirely. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cracking, "I invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination." Judge Morrison's verdict came. Swiftly and decisively, all charges against David were dismissed with prejudice. Margaret was ordered to make full restitution to every homeowner who had been defrauded. But her cooperation and status as a victim of blackmail were noted for sentencing considerations. As for Blackwood, Judge Morrison ordered an immediate investigation by the State Bar Association and referred the case to the FBI for federal prosecution. But the story's final twist came 3 weeks later. David was enjoying his first peaceful morning of fishing in months when his phone rang. It was FBI agent Patricia Keller with news that left him speechless. "Mr. Chen, we've been investigating Mr. Blackwood's activities across 3 states. Your case broke open what appears to be a massive elder fraud operation targeting horror communities. We've identified at least 30 other neighborhoods where similar schemes were operating." The scope was staggering. Blackwood had been using local horror officials as unwitting accomplices in a multi-million-dollar fraud network, targeting retirees and elderly homeowners who were unlikely to have the resources to fight back. Us. David cast his line into the mirror-smooth surface of his lake. He reflected on the journey that had brought him here. What started as a simple dispute about fishing rights had exposed one of the largest HOA fraud schemes in state history. Margaret Holloway, now free from Blackwood's control, had become an unlikely ally in helping other victims reclaim their properties and their peace. The morning mist clung to the water as David's line disappeared beneath the surface. For the first time in months, Mirror Lake truly felt like home again. Justice, like the fish he hoped to catch, had simply required patience, persistence, and the courage to cast his line into uncertain waters. Behind him, his cabin stood secure, on land that was undeniably, legally, and permanently his, and somewhere in the distance, other retirees in other communities were learning that they, too, had the power to fight back against those who would steal their dreams. The lake was calm, the fish were biting, and David Chen was finally truly home.